At 17, aged out of the system with nothing but a bus ticket, he thought he was alone. But a strange inheritance, a rusted Quonset hut bought for $5, would lead him to a truth buried for years and force him to survive a storm that would test everything he thought he knew about what it means to build a home. If you've ever felt lost, if you've ever had to start over from scratch, then this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, because we're going to talk about finding your way back, even when it feels like there's no road left to follow. The air in the bus station tasted of diesel fumes and disinfectant, a combination I'd come to associate with endings. It was 3 days after my 17th birthday. In my left hand, I held a one-way ticket to a town I'd never heard of. In my right, a thin manila envelope that felt as flimsy as my future. Mrs. Gable, my foster mother for the last 2 years, had pressed it into my hand at the door, her face a careful mask of detached sympathy. "The state considers you capable now, Leo," she'd said, the words precise and sterile. "It's time for you to start your own life." Capable. It was a word they used in paperwork, a box to be checked. It had nothing to do with the hollow feeling spreading through my chest, a cold echo in a space that had been empty for a long time. 2 years of silent dinners, 2 years of keeping my head down, of making myself small and quiet so as not to be a bother. 2 years of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And here it was, a worn-out sneaker kicking me squarely out the door. They weren't cruel people, the Gables. They were just tired. They were a service provider, and my service contract had expired. That's how it felt. I was a line item, a case file stamped closed. 5 years in the system, ever since my grandmother passed, had taught me not to expect much more. You learn to travel light. You learn that home is a temporary word. You learn to recognize the look in people's eyes when they've reached their limit. I saw it in Mrs. Gable's eyes that morning, a quiet, exhausted relief. I looked at the bus, its silver sides gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the terminal bay. It hissed, purging its air brakes like a great, tired beast sighing. That was me, a great, tired sigh. I had $212 in my pocket, the last of the monthly state stipend the Gables had dutifully saved for me, and this envelope. I didn't want to open it. I imagined it contained some final, patronizing piece of advice, a pamphlet on finding low-income housing or a list of temp agencies, another institution's idea of a helping hand. I slid onto a cold plastic seat, the vinyl cracked and peeling, and stared at the clock on the wall. 20 minutes until departure. 20 minutes until the last thin thread connecting me to anything resembling a life was severed. The terminal was a river of detached humanity. People hugging loved ones goodbye, travelers checking phones, a kid crying while his mother tried to soothe him. I was an island in the middle of it, invisible. The loneliness was a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I thought of my grandmother, a memory that was growing faded and soft around the edges, like an old photograph. I remembered the smell of her kitchen, of baking bread and dried lavender. I remembered the weight of her hand on my shoulder, a solid, unconditional presence. That was the last time I'd felt truly anchored to the world. When she died, the anchor chain snapped, and I'd been drifting ever since. The foster homes were just ports in a storm, places to tie up for a while before the tide pulled me back out to sea. Now, the tide was pulling me out for good. I pulled the tab on the envelope. My fingers were numb with cold and apprehension. Might as well see the final report card. Might as well know the full extent of the damage. The bus engine rumbled beneath my feet, a low, constant vibration that seemed to work its way into my bones. I had finally opened the envelope, not in the sterile quiet of the terminal, but here, in the anonymous motion of the highway. The city was already a smudge of gray in the rear view, giving way to the sprawling, identical suburbs. Inside the envelope wasn't a pamphlet. It was the cash, the $212, and a single, folded sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper. It was letterhead. Albright and Finch, attorneys at law. The name meant nothing to me. The letter was dated a week prior and addressed to me, care of the Gables. It was formal, dense with legal jargon that made my head swim. Clauses and sub-clauses, references to estates and trusts. I had to read it 3 times before the meaning started to surface, like a shape rising from murky water. It was about my grandmother, Eleanor Vance. Pursuant to the last will and testament of the deceased, it began, a tertiary provision within the Eleanor Vance Irrevocable Trust is set to activate upon your 17th birthday or legal emancipation, whichever comes first. The words felt like a foreign language describing a country I'd never visited. My grandmother had a lawyer? A trust? She had been a librarian. Her life was quiet, ordered, and, I had always assumed, simple. She had her small house, her garden, and her books. The idea of her navigating the world of trusts and lawyers felt alien. The letter went on. It explained that the primary assets of the trust had been depleted, as expected, years ago. But this tertiary provision was different. It concerned a single, non-liquid asset, a piece of real property. The property was described in the driest possible terms. Lot 7, Section 4, on County Road 113, Havenwood. And on this lot was a single structure. One Quonset-style utility building. A Quonset hut, a metal barn. My inheritance was a tin can in a field. The letter stated that the trust, which had held the title and paid the property taxes for the past 5 years, was now legally obligated to dissolve. I had a 30-day window to claim the property. If I failed to do so, it would be forfeited to the county for non-payment of the now due taxes. The absurdity of it was staggering. My grandmother, the woman who pressed flowers in books and made jam from the berries in her yard, had left me a rusty metal shed. Then came the final, baffling detail. To execute the transfer of the deed, I was required to remit a processing and finalization fee. The fee was $5. I stared at the words. $5. $5. It had to be a typo, a cruel joke. But the formality of the letter, the dense legalese surrounding it, suggested it was anything but. There was a phone number at the bottom for a Mr. James Albright. I looked out the window. The suburbs were thinning now, replaced by stretches of pale, winter-fallow farmland. The sky was a vast, empty sheet of white. What was I supposed to do with this? A useless piece of land and a metal hut, hours away from anything I knew, with a $5 price tag that made it all feel like a fever dream. The letter contained one more enclosure, a map. A simple, hand-drawn map on a piece of graph paper showing a bus stop in a town called Havenwood, and a dotted line leading a few miles out to a spot marked with a small, hand-drawn arch. My grandmother's neat, familiar handwriting. My Quonset hut. The bus ticket in my pocket was for Havenwood. The Gables had known. They hadn't just kicked me out, they had aimed me. They had pointed me toward this bizarre inheritance and washed their hands of me. The cold feeling in my chest deepened. This wasn't a new beginning. It was a final disposal. The bus ride stretched into an eternity. For hours, the world outside the window was a repeating loop of brown fields, skeletal trees, and distant, lonely farmhouses, each with a plume of smoke rising from its chimney like a fragile signal of life. The rhythmic drone of the bus was a hypnotic lullaby of despair. With every mile that passed, the city, the system, the life I knew, however temporary and conditional it had been, receded further, dissolving into an abstraction. Ahead of me lay only the unknown, and the unknown had the shape of a rusted metal arch on a piece of graph paper. I leaned my head against the cool glass of the window, the vibration a constant reminder of my forward motion into nothingness. I tried to summon a clearer picture of my grandmother's face, but all I could recall was a feeling, a sense of safety, of quiet warmth that felt a million miles away. Why would she do this? The question looped in my mind, relentless and unanswerable. Why not just leave me whatever money she had? Why this elaborate, confusing scheme with lawyers and trusts and a $5 hut? It felt like a puzzle with half the pieces missing, a joke without a punchline. I imagined her, in her final days, poring over maps, talking to a lawyer, setting this strange plan in motion. It didn't fit the woman I remembered, the woman who read poetry to me before bed, whose hands always smelled faintly of paper and soil. Was there a part of her I never knew? A secret, pragmatic core beneath the gentle exterior? Or was this the act of a mind clouded by illness, a final, desperate gesture that made no logical sense? I had no way of knowing. All I had was the letter from Mr. Albright, the hand-drawn map, and a bus ticket bought by people who couldn't wait to see the back of me. Late in the afternoon, the bus slowed, its turn signal clicking rhythmically. The driver's voice crackled over the intercom. "Havenwood! Next stop, Havenwood!" I peered out the window. Havenwood wasn't so much a town as a suggestion of one. A crossroads with a single blinking traffic light, a gas station with peeling paint, a diner with a buzzing neon sign that read, "Eat," and a squat brick building that served as the post office. That was it. The bus hissed to a stop, and the doors folded open, letting in a blast of cold, damp air that smelled of wet earth and distant wood smoke. I was the only one who got off. The bus pulled away with another sigh of its brakes, leaving me standing in an almost profound silence, broken only by the hum of the diner sign and the lonely creak of the traffic lights swinging in the wind. I was truly alone now. The feeling was no longer an abstract dread. It was a physical presence, as real as the worn strap of the duffel bag digging into my shoulder. I walked into the diner. A bell chimed weakly above the door. Inside, a handful of men in work boots and flannel shirts sat at the counter, nursing cups of coffee. They glanced at me, their gazes lingering for a moment before returning to their conversations. I was an anomaly, a stranger in a place where there were no strangers. A woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Brenda wiped down the counter. "Help you with something, honey?" she asked, her voice raspy but not unkind. "I'm looking for County Road 113, I said, my voice sounding small and foreign. She gave me a long look, taking in my thin jacket and the duffel bag. "That's a ways out, couple miles east. Nothing out there but old fields." "I know," I said. "I'm supposed to. There's a property." She raised an eyebrow but didn't press. She just pointed out the window. "Follow this road. It turns into 113 after the old bridge. Can't miss it." I thanked her, bought a bottle of water I couldn't really afford, and walked back out into the cold. The sun was getting low, painting the underside of the heavy gray clouds in shades of bruised purple and orange. The walk began. My inheritance was waiting. The pavement gave way to gravel, and the last of the town's few houses disappeared behind me. The road stretched out, a pale ribbon winding through a landscape of stark, beautiful desolation. The wind had picked up, a steady, insistent force that pushed against me, whipping my hair across my face and chilling me to the bone. It carried the scent of rain. I pulled my jacket tighter and walked on, my sneakers crunching on the loose stones. The sky was immense, a towering dome of churning gray clouds that seemed to press down on the flat earth. I felt exposed, a tiny, insignificant figure moving through a vast, indifferent world. There were no cars, no signs of life, save for a few crows circling high overhead. I followed the map from memory, past the collapsed ruin of an old wooden bridge, and onto the road Brenda had pointed out. County Road 113. After what felt like an hour, but was probably only 30 minutes, I saw it. At first, it was just a dark curve on the horizon, barely distinguishable from the low hills. But as I got closer, the shape resolved itself. A perfect, soaring arch of corrugated metal, dulled by time and stained with long, weeping streaks of rust. It was bigger than I had imagined, a hulking, silent behemoth rising from a sea of tangled brown weeds. A sagging barbed wire fence marked the edge of the property. This was it. Lot 7, Section 4. My grandmother's legacy. My $5 kingdom. I stopped at the fence line and just stared. A wave of something cold and heavy washed over me. Not just the wind, but a profound, gut-wrenching despair. It was worse than I could have pictured. It wasn't a building. It was a ruin. A monument to neglect. What had she been thinking? This wasn't a gift. It was a burden. A punchline to a joke I was only now beginning to understand. I found a gap in the fence and pushed my way through the thorny brush. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and debris. As I got closer, the scale of the hut was intimidating. It was long, maybe 100 feet, and tall enough to fit a semi-truck. The main door was a massive sliding panel of rusted steel, held shut by a thick chain and a heavy, corroded padlock. There was no getting through that. I walked the perimeter, my feet sinking into the soft, damp earth. The metal walls were cold to the touch. In some places, the rust had eaten clean through, leaving jagged holes that gaped like wounds. Wind whistled through them with a low, mournful sound. Around the back, I found a smaller, standard-sized door, also padlocked. This one, however, was set in a frame that was nearly rusted away from the main structure. Hope, or maybe just desperation, flickered in my chest. I picked up a heavy, flat rock from the ground. It took 3 hard, clumsy swings. The shriek of tortured metal echoed across the empty fields as the rusted hasp tore away from the frame. The door swung inward with a groan, opening into a cavern of absolute darkness. I hesitated at the threshold, peering into the black. The air that flowed out was stale and cold, thick with the smell of dust, damp, and the faint metallic scent of decay. It smelled like a tomb. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. For a moment, I was completely blind. Then, as my eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the gloom. The interior was vast, an unbroken cavern under the high, curved ceiling. Faint light filtered down from dozens of small holes in the roof, creating shifting columns of dusty sunlight that made the air itself seem solid. The floor was bare concrete, cracked and stained. The place was almost entirely empty. Debris, scraps of wood, leaves, a shattered bottle, was scattered around the edges, blown in through the holes over the years. It was a hollow shell, a place devoid of history or purpose. My heart sank even further. There was nothing here, absolutely nothing. And then I saw it. Right in the center of that vast, empty space, placed with an unnerving deliberateness, was a single object. A dark green, military-style footlocker. It wasn't covered in dust or debris. It looked as if it had been placed there only yesterday. It sat on the concrete floor like an altar in a ruined cathedral, the beams of light from the roof seeming to converge upon it. I walked toward it slowly, my footsteps echoing in the immense silence. Every instinct told me this was it. This was the reason. The hut wasn't the inheritance, it was the vault. I knelt beside the footlocker. It was heavy steel, with sturdy latches on the front. It wasn't locked. My fingers trembled as I reached for the clasps. They were stiff, but they opened with a loud, satisfying thunk. I paused, my heart hammering against my ribs. Whatever was inside was the answer to the question that had been haunting me for days. I lifted the heavy lid. The first thing that hit me was the smell of old paper and cedar. The footlocker was packed to the brim. On top, nestled in a bed of what looked like cedar chips, was a thick, rectangular object wrapped in oilcloth. Beneath it, the rest of the space was filled with bundles of letters, tied neatly with twine, each bundle marked with a year. And underneath the letters, I could see the edges of thick, vacuum-sealed plastic bags. I carefully lifted the oilcloth-wrapped package. It was heavy. Unfolding the stiff, waxy fabric, I found a book. A beautiful, leather-bound journal, its cover blank. I set it aside and reached for the topmost bundle of letters. The tag read, "For Leo." My name, in my grandmother's elegant, familiar script. My breath caught in my throat. This was a message sent across 5 years of silence. I untied the twine and unfolded the first letter. The paper was crisp, the ink a faded blue. "My dearest Leo," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the world has not been as kind to you as I would have wished. And for that, I am more sorry than I can ever say." The words blurred as tears welled in my eyes. I wiped them away impatiently and kept reading. Her voice, so long a faint echo in my memory, came rushing back, clear and strong, from the page. She explained everything. She told me about her diagnosis, the one she'd kept secret. She knew she didn't have long. She knew the system that was waiting for children like me, a system of strangers and temporary homes. She knew my father, her son, was tangled in debts and addictions, and that he and my mother couldn't be trusted to care for me. She couldn't bear the thought of me being lost in that shuffle. So she had made a plan, a desperate, radical plan. She sold her house, the small house with the garden that held all my childhood memories. She sold everything of value. With the proceeds, she didn't set up a simple savings account that could be contested or drained by my parents or seized by the state to pay for my care. Instead, she created a ghost. She worked with an old friend, a lawyer named James Albright, to form a small, anonymous corporation. That corporation bought this piece of land and this Quonset hut for next to nothing. It was a forgotten property, commercially worthless, and therefore invisible. She paid the property taxes 5 years in advance through the trust, creating a buffer of time. The $5 fee was a legal maneuver Mr. Albright had devised, a way to make the final transfer to me as solid and uncontestable as possible, a symbolic payment that fulfilled the letter of the law. This place, this rusty, derelict shed, wasn't an oversight. It was a fortress. It was a bunker designed to protect her last, most precious asset, me. I put the letter down, my hands shaking. The sheer, fierce, calculating love behind the act was overwhelming. She hadn't abandoned me to the system. She had been fighting for me, even from beyond the grave, in the only way she knew how. I looked around the vast, empty hut, at the light streaming through the holes in the roof. It no longer looked like a ruin. It looked like a sanctuary. I reached back into the footlocker and lifted out one of the vacuum-sealed bags. It was heavy, dense. Inside were stacks of $100 bills. I pulled out another and another. There were 10 of them. I didn't know how much it was, but it was more money than I had ever seen in my life. It was what was left from the sale of her house. It was my start. It was survival. At the very bottom of the locker, I found a small locked metal box. The key was taped to the underside of the footlocker's lid. I unlocked it. Inside was the official deed to the property, a folded, crisp document with my name typed on it, waiting for my signature. And there was one more letter. This one was shorter, the handwriting a little less steady. "My Leo," it said, "the money is for you to live. The land is for you to choose. There is a company, a big developer, that wants this whole area. They have bought up all the farms around this little plot. They think this land is abandoned. They will come for it. They will offer you money, probably a lot of it. Or they will try to bully you, to use the law and the back taxes to take it from you. You can take their money and run, Leo. Go somewhere new, start over. No one would blame you. It would be the easy thing to do. Or you can stay. You can fight for this little piece of nothing. It's not a house, but it can be a home if you want it to be. The choice is yours. For the first time, the choice is truly yours. This is the one thing they can't take from you, a choice. Whatever you do, know that I love you. Always. Grandma." I sat there on the cold concrete floor, the letter in my hand, the deed and the money, and my grandmother's journal surrounding me like the components of a life I hadn't yet begun to live. The weight of it all crashed down on me. 5 years of numbness, of carefully constructed walls, crumbled in an instant. I put my head in my hands and I wept. I cried for my grandmother, for the magnitude of her sacrifice. I cried for the little boy who lost her and had to learn to be a ghost in other people's houses. I cried for the anger I felt at a world that made her plan necessary, and for the sudden, terrifying, exhilarating burden of her final gift. Freedom. A choice. Run or fight. Disappear or build. For so long, my life had been a series of things happening to me. I was moved, I was placed, I was discharged. Now, for the first time, I had to decide what was going to happen next. The sun was setting, and the light inside the hut was fading, the columns of dust disappearing into the growing twilight. The wind howled outside, a lonely, wild sound, and in the center of that empty, waiting space, I was faced with the first real decision of my life. Have you ever been given a choice that was so heavy it felt like it could break you? A choice where the easy path leads away from everything that matters, and the hard path leads right into the heart of the storm. If you're standing at a crossroads like that right now, in any part of your life, I want you to know you're not alone. So many of us are told to take the easy way out. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to choose the harder right over the easier wrong. Your story, your choice, it matters. It's a testament to your strength. Now, let's get back to what I decided, alone in that growing darkness. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark, just breathing. The initial storm of emotion passed, leaving behind a strange, quiet calm. The choice my grandmother had laid before me felt monumental, but in that moment, it also felt simple. To take the developer's money and run would be to prove the world right, that I was transient, that I had no roots, that I was just passing through. It would be an admission that this place, her final gift, was just a commodity to be sold. To stay felt like an answer. It was an act of defiance. It was choosing to believe that this piece of nothing could be something. It was choosing her. I folded the letter, placed it carefully back in the metal box with the deed, and closed the lid. I wasn't running. This rusty can, this patch of weeds, this was mine. It was the first thing in 5 years that was truly, unconditionally mine, and I was going to hold on to it. The next morning, I woke up stiff and cold on the concrete floor, my duffel bag for a pillow. The decision made in the darkness felt just as solid in the pale morning light. The first order of business was survival. This hut had to become livable, and fast. I took one of the vacuum-sealed bags of cash, slid it open with a shard of glass, and pulled out a few $100s. The bills felt unreal in my hand, like play money. I locked the footlocker, dragged it to a corner, and camouflaged it with some scrap wood and debris. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. Then I walked back to town. The journey felt different this time. The landscape wasn't desolate anymore. It was mine. The wind wasn't a threat. It was just the sound of my own private world. In Havenwood, I went to the small hardware store. An old man with a kind face and flour-dusted overalls watched me as I wandered the aisles, picking out things I thought I would need. Heavy-duty tarps, buckets of roofing sealant, a good sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a propane camp stove, a lantern, work gloves. I was a strange sight, a kid buying supplies for a full-scale renovation and paying in cash. He didn't ask any questions, just rang it all up. "Got a big project?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Something like that," I said. He nodded slowly. "Weather's turning. Radio's talking about a big storm system moving in. Be careful out there." I thanked him for the warning and hauled my supplies back out to the road. It took me 2 trips, the weight of it all, a satisfying ache in my muscles. This was the feeling of building something. Back at the hut, I got to work. I spent the rest of the day on the roof, a dangerous, slippery expanse of curved metal, patching the dozens of holes with sealant and tarps. It was clumsy, messy work. But with each hole I covered, the space inside grew a little darker, a little more protected. It was an act of claiming. I swept the floors, clearing out 5 years of accumulated dust and leaves. The physical labor was grounding, chasing away the ghosts of doubt and fear. As evening fell, I sat on an overturned bucket, eating lukewarm canned chili heated on my new camp stove. The single flame of the stove and the soft hiss of the lantern pushed back the immense darkness. It wasn't much, but it was a start. It was a home being born. The next day, I found the number for Mr. Albright and called him from the payphone outside the diner. His voice was exactly as I'd imagined, dry, professional, and calm. "Mr. Albright, this is Leo Vance." There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Vance," he said, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly, a hint of surprise in it. "I received your file from the Gables. I was expecting to hear from you." "I'm at the property," I said. "I've read my grandmother's letters. I'm staying. Another pause, longer this time. I see, he said. That is unexpected. The developers, Triton Land Corp., have already made an inquiry. I don't care, I said, the words coming out stronger than I felt. This is my property. I want to finalize the transfer. Very well, he said. You'll need to wire the $5 fee and the outstanding tax balance. I'll handle the paperwork from there. But Leo, be careful. Triton doesn't like to lose. I wired the money. It felt like the most important transaction of my life. As I walked out of the post office, I noticed the sky. The old man at the hardware store had been right. The clouds were a strange, bruised, greenish gray, and they were moving fast. The air was thick, heavy, and eerily still. The usual wind had died down completely. An oppressive silence had fallen over the landscape. Back at the hut, the stillness was even more pronounced. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I secured the last of the tarps on the roof and double-checked the latch on the main door. The quiet was making me nervous. I turned on a small battery-powered radio I'd bought. The local station was a constant stream of urgent warnings. A severe thunderstorm watch had been upgraded to a tornado warning for the entire county. Seek shelter immediately, the announcer's voice said, tinny and frantic. Basements, interior rooms, away from windows. I looked around my metal cylinder. I had no basement. I had no interior rooms. Every part of this place was the outside wall. A knot of pure, cold fear tightened in my stomach. I was miles from town, alone, in a metal tube directly in the path of a tornado. The sound started as a low rumble, like a distant train, but it grew quickly, exponentially. The eerie silence was shattered by a rising roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The air pressure dropped so suddenly it made my ears pop. The metal walls of the hut began to vibrate, a low hum that escalated into a high-pitched shriek. I scrambled away from the walls, to the center of the floor, next to the footlocker, my grandmother's anchor. I huddled down, wrapping my arms over my head as the roar became an all-consuming, physical presence. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a force, a solid wall of noise that vibrated through the concrete floor and into my bones. The hut, my fortress, was groaning under the strain. The metal panels buckled and screamed. I could hear things, big things, smashing against the outside. The sound of 1,000 nails being scraped down the world's biggest chalkboard. The building felt like it was being lifted, shaken by a giant, furious hand. Light flashed as a piece of debris tore a new hole in the roof, and for a second I could see a vortex of black cloud and swirling wreckage. I closed my eyes and pressed myself against the floor, certain that in the next second the roof would tear away and I would be gone. This was it. This was how it ended, not in a foster home, not on the streets, but here, in this metal tomb my grandmother had left me. The roar was absolute. There was no thought, no fear, just the overwhelming, deafening end of the world. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The deafening roar receded, leaving behind a ringing silence that was almost as shocking. A gentle patter of rain began, tapping on the metal roof. For a full minute, I didn't move. I lay on the concrete floor, every muscle in my body clenched, waiting for the noise to return. But it didn't. There was only the rain and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Slowly, unsteadily, I pushed myself up. My ears were ringing and my body trembled with adrenaline. The hut was still standing. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and wet earth. Light poured in through a new, jagged hole in the roof, but the main structure was intact. It was dented, battered, and leaking in a dozen new places, but it had held. The curved, low-profile design that I had thought was so ugly, so industrial, had saved me. The wind had flowed over it, instead of catching it and tearing it apart. I stumbled to the door, my legs feeling weak and disconnected. I pushed it open and stepped outside, and I froze. The world was gone. Everything was gone. The landscape I had walked through just hours before had been wiped clean, as if by an angry god. The skeletal trees were snapped in half, their trunks splintered and twisted. The field of weeds was a sea of mud and unrecognizable debris. And down the road, where a handful of houses had stood, small farmhouses, a couple of mobile homes, there was nothing, just foundations. Splintered wood, insulation, and the random, pathetic detritus of shattered lives were strewn for hundreds of yards. The tornado had carved a path of absolute destruction, and my little hut stood right on the edge of it. 6 houses on this road were gone, and mine was still here. I stood there, soaked by the gentle rain, in profound, numbing shock. I looked at the path of the tornado, a wide, violent scar across the earth. Then I looked back at my dented, ugly, beautiful Quonset hut. It had held. My grandmother's fortress had held. In the distance I heard the first faint sound of sirens. Help was coming. But for a moment, standing in the wreckage of my neighbors' lives, next to the one structure left standing, I understood. My grandmother hadn't just given me a shelter. She had given me something that was built to endure. The sirens grew louder, a chorus of wailing that cut through the rain-soaked quiet. Within 20 minutes, the road was filled with flashing lights. Sheriff's deputies, fire trucks, ambulances. First responders swarmed the area, their faces grim as they took in the scale of the devastation. They moved with a practiced urgency, fanning out across the debris fields, their voices calling out into the wreckage. I just stood by my hut, a ghost in my own front yard, watching them work. A deputy, a big man with a rain-slicked hat, approached me. "Son, are you all right? Were you here when it hit?" I nodded, unable to speak. His eyes widened as he looked from me to the hut, then back to the empty foundations down the road. "You were in there?" he asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. I nodded again. He just shook his head slowly, a look of stunned respect on his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, the same words the farmer would use later. He told me to stay put, that they were setting up a command post at the crossroads. As the afternoon wore on, more people arrived. Neighbors from other roads, volunteers from town, people who had lost everything, and people who had come to help those who had. They moved through the wreckage, a somber, determined community forged in an instant by shared disaster. A man in his 60s, his face etched with grime and grief, walked over to me. He was wearing a torn flannel shirt and jeans caked in mud. He just stood there for a moment, looking at the Quonset hut. "That's a miracle," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm George," he added, extending a hand. "Or I was. My place was the blue one, down by the creek." Was. The word hung in the air. "I'm Leo," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was like iron. "You're the new kid," he said, his eyes studying me. "Heard someone bought the old surplus hut. Didn't think anyone was crazy enough to live in it." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Guess the crazy paid off." He looked back at the remains of his farm. Lost everything. House, barn, all of it. He wasn't talking to me, really. He was just thinking out loud, processing the impossible. Then he looked back at me, his gaze clear. You need anything? You got power? Water? No, I said. Just what I've got inside. That was the moment everything changed. The tornado had made me a survivor, and in this place, at this moment, that made me a neighbor. The story spread quickly through the assembled crowd of survivors and volunteers. The kid in the metal hut who rode out the storm. People who had walked past me in town without a second glance now came over to clap me on the shoulder, to offer me a bottle of water, a hot cup of coffee from a thermos. They were reeling from their own losses, yet they took a moment to acknowledge my survival. The barrier of being an outsider, a stranger, had been obliterated by the storm. We were all just people who had been in the path. The news crews arrived later, and the story became something else. A quirky human interest piece for the evening broadcast. Teen survives tornado in $5 home. For a few days, my hut was a minor celebrity. But the cameras left, and the real work began. George, who had lost his home but not his spirit, became my mentor. He had a generator he'd salvaged from his ruined workshop, and he insisted on running a cord to my hut. No sense in both of us sitting in the dark, he said. He had a lifetime's worth of tools, and he taught me how to use them. How to properly patch the new holes in the roof. How to frame a real door. How to build a platform for my sleeping bag to get it off the cold concrete. The money from my grandmother's footlocker became a lifeline, not just for me, but for the recovery. I bought lumber, insulation, and supplies, and George and I worked side by side. We worked on my hut, and then we worked on clearing the debris from his land. Other neighbors joined in. It was a slow, heartbreaking, and profoundly hopeful process. We were rebuilding together. The development company, Triton, made a few quiet inquiries through Mr. Albright, but the timing was terrible for them. Trying to force a tornado survivor off his land wasn't a good look. For the first time, they were the ones on the back foot. My grandmother's invisible fortress, ironically, had become famous. And its fame was its best defense. The seasons turned. The scars on the landscape began to heal, covered over by the stubborn green of new growth. My hut was no longer a hollow metal shell. It was a home. I had insulated the walls, installed a small wood stove that George helped me find at a salvage yard, and built shelves for my few possessions. The leather-bound journal my grandmother had left me sat on one of those shelves. I had started writing in it, chronicling the work, the people I was meeting, the slow, steady process of building a life from the ground up. I worked part-time for George, helping him rebuild his fences and clear his fields. He paid me a fair wage, but the real payment was the knowledge he shared, the quiet companionship. I learned the rhythms of the land, the language of the weather. I was no longer a boy from the city, adrift in the system. I was Leo, the kid from the Quonset hut on County Road 113. I belonged. One evening, sitting by the wood stove, the air outside crisp with the coming autumn, I read my grandmother's letters again. I finally understood the depth of her wisdom. She couldn't have predicted the tornado, of course, but she had understood something essential about strength. She hadn't given me a beautiful house, vulnerable and fragile. She had given me something ugly, strong, and underestimated. Something that could withstand a storm. Her plan wasn't just about giving me a physical shelter. It was about giving me a chance to develop the resilience I would need to survive in the world. The money was a tool, the land was an anchor, but the choice to stay, the fight to build, that was the true inheritance. Home, I realized, wasn't a place you are given, it's a place you make. It's not about perfect walls or a fancy roof. It's about the choice to dig in your heels and say, "This is my place." It's about the work you put in with your own 2 hands and the community you build around you, one act of kindness at a time. My grandmother didn't abandon me. She liberated me. She led me to a field of weeds and a rusty metal can. And in doing so, she gave me the entire world. She gave me a foundation, not of concrete, but of choice, and the strength to build upon it. That tornado took 6 houses, but it gave me a home. It taught me that the strongest structures aren't always the prettiest. Sometimes they're just the ones built to endure, the ones that have been stripped down to what is essential. Sometimes true strength is found in the places everyone else has overlooked. Maybe your storm isn't a tornado. Maybe it's a job loss, a betrayal, a diagnosis, or just that quiet, crushing feeling of being completely and utterly lost. But what my grandmother taught me, and what that storm proved, is that you can build a life out of the wreckage. You can find your foundation even in a field of weeds. You can find your strength in the very things that were meant to break you. This community we're building here is for people who know what it's like to weather a storm. For people who have had to build their own shelter when no one else would provide one. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to build something from nothing, then hit that subscribe button and become a part of it. And in the comments below, I want you to tell me about your Quonset hut. What's the one thing, the one person, the one choice that held you together when the winds were howling? I'll be reading every single one of your stories, because we're all survivors here, and we're building this place together.